country. He was one of the leaders of the suffragette movement. Later, he campaigned against the war, and later he campaigned for freer education, and then he campaigned against communism, and then he campaigned against the Americans. So he had an active life. So for me, going through that correspondence with all these particular figures was a wonderful experience, and nothing is more vivid than to see a world come alive through such correspondences. Now, gradually, McMaster had decided that something has to be done with these papers. So he put together an editorial project. The editorial project, I didn't want to join it because I'll tell you in a minute what editorial projects do. It wasn't my cup of tea. And asked from Shirk about $2 million, and then found a board consisting of some of the greatest names in philosophy in North America came, and they sanctioned it, and we did an editorial project. Now, what does the editorial project do? Now, this is one of the boiler rooms of the university. What you have to do is whoever you pick, whether it's Michael Ignatieff, Bertrand Russell, Adolf Hitler, whatever, you have to put out accurate manuscripts of their writings. Now that seems to be pretty easy to do, but it becomes very, very clear afterwards when I actually joined the project later. I could see how difficult that is. Because especially if you take a writer like Russell, there are several editions of his books around, and many of them are different from one another. So who is the real Russell? So how do you find that out? You get a manuscript, you find the original manuscript, if you can, of his handwriting. Then you read these things aloud, and then when you find a mistake, which we always did, you correct them, and then get authentic manuscripts that you print. In one case, we found one of his books that had gone through 15 copies, 15 editions, had 4 pages missing in every edition. Why is this important? Sometimes it's crucially important. One case I could tell you about is the diary of Anne Frank. Anne Frank's diary was one of the pièces de résistance of Holocaust denial, because there were several different editions of it around. Now, how did this happen? Her father got hold of it, and he purged all the references to sex. And then somebody wanted to do a play about it, which was playing last week in Hamilton, corrected. So they changed it around a bit for that. Then it was a movie, and it was changed around for that. So you have several different editions. So the movement of Holocaust denial, which was so strong in the 80s, that particular movement run by the fascists, pointed the diary of Anne Frank as being a complete fraud. So that was one of the pieces of evidence about the fraudulent nature of the Holocaust, that it never happened. So you have to have some body in the university that produces reliable texts. Sounds boring, but it has its moments of excitement. Now when you see, by the way, the diary of Anne Frank, if you see the bookstore, you'll see edited by, meaning that the whole thing has been put together in a proper way. So they decided, before I came, that in the Bertrand Russell editorial project, we would put out all of his articles. And when you put out an article, thousands of them, 15 volumes have come out. There are still 8 to go. most of us, if we spent all our time writing, could hardly produce that. I joined one of the volumes that was connected to the First World War, and so I saw day by day the first anti-war movement in the West, its ordeals, its triumphs, and so on. I'll talk about it a bit later. So the editorial project got going, a different editor came every time, and then I became the director of the project for a few years, and we had to get these volumes out. Now, being director of the project became another 20th century epic. First, I had one episode that in the letters, I discovered one letter from a man named Allen who said, Dear Bertrand Russell, my brother-in-law drives me crazy. He can't understand your work. And now he's written an article against Bertrand Russell. And it's published in the Dalhousie Review of 1954. Well, I was in Dalhousie in 1954. Who could it have been? So I dug up the Dalhousie Review of 1954, and there's a letter by George Grant, who was then the chairman of our department. I said, I went to see him. I said, do you have any relatives who are interested in Russell? He says, yes, it's that Alan, my wife's brother, you know, who's very upset that I'm not a disciple of Russell. I subsequently met him. Some of the great correspondences there, one is coming out this year, between Russell and Gilbert Murray. Gilbert Murray lived until the late 50s or 60s, a correspondence that started in 1930. So here's a correspondence. They came into conflict with one another over the First World War. So here's a correspondence that covered virtually the whole of the first half of the 20th century. And both were very active. Murray was very active in setting up the League of Nations and then the United Nations. So there you had a nice balance of things. This correspondence is going to be published this year, I think. A couple of the things, aside from this George Grant episode, were the wars of the publishers. Of course, Bertrand Russell editorial project had to have a publisher who would publish all of the work. And it was very, finally we found in London Bertrand Russell's own publisher, George Allen and Unwin. And they ran this lovely publishing company just around the corner from the British Museum. And then, somewhere in the 1960s, the War of the Publishers began. By the War of the Publishers, I mean wars in which publishing companies were trying to take out each other and buy up each other. I happened to be at Allen and Unwin's after I'd become the director one day, and the atmosphere, as I wrote home, was like that of the embassy of Britain in Poland in 1939. I experienced for the first time in my life inside what's called a hostile takeover. That is, another company bought them out. And the shareholders, so Allen and Unwin, disappeared before my sight. Then this company didn't do well, so then the Russell papers were bought by Harper's company. The Harper's company wanted everything from Allen and Unwin, but they didn't want the Russell papers. So if these were being sold off, here's all our work going for nothing. They were selling it for nothing. You could have bought it in the second-hand bookstores